My name is Wei, and I'm the analyst working on the power sector as part of our Tracking Progress series. I'm here this morning to take you through some of our key findings from our analysis of emissions reduction activities in this sector. Emissions from the power sector come from the combustion of fossil fuels for the generation of electricity. Data from our national greenhouse gas inventory shows that these emissions account for about a third of Australia's national emissions. Most of these comprise of emissions from electricity that is consumed in the buildings and industry sectors, as you can see on the pie chart on the left. More than half of these emissions come from black coal generators, while brown coal generators account for most of the remaining emissions. Emissions from the power sector have decreased by about 13% from its peak 4 years ago. This improvement has been the result of both a reduction in demand for grid electricity and improvements to the generation mix. And I'll go through that in a bit more detail in just a second. We looked at emissions reduction activities in 3 separate categories in the power sector. These categories are demand for grid electricity, renewable generation, and fossil fuel generation, both gas and coal. Our analysis shows that emissions reduction activities have occurred in all 3 areas. Demand for grid electricity has gone down in recent years. Renewables and gas generation have both gone up in the past 10 years, while coal generation has decreased. These activities have meant that improvements have occurred in all of these categories. Australia's demand for grid electricity has decreased by 5% in the past 4 years. This follows a period of strong historic growth in the 1990s and early 2000s. Demand in recent years has also been consistently lower than what was previously forecasted, as shown here on this graph. This reduction in demand have come primarily from a reduction in manufacturing output, rapid uptake of distributed energy, particularly solar PV in residential buildings, energy efficiency improvements in the buildings and industry sectors. Milder weather in recent years have also played a role in reducing demand for grid electricity. In addition to recent reductions in demand, there's also been a strong shift towards cleaner technologies in the electricity generation mix. In the past 10 years, large-scale renewable generation has grown by 62% and now accounts for 12% of total grid electricity generated. Much of this growth was in wind generation, driven by the large-scale renewable energy target, which has encouraged the investment of more than 1,500 wind turbines. In recent years, hydro generation has also recovered following the end of the drought in 2009. The combined effect of an increasing renewable share in a market with slowing demand has contributed significantly to improving the emissions intensity of Australia's generation mix. In other words, with the recent slowdown of demand for grid electricity, the increasing share of renewable generation, which produces no emissions, has meant that less emissions is produced per unit of electricity generated. Within fossil fuel generation itself, there has also been a shift towards less emissions-intensive generation sources. Firstly, coal generation has decreased by 14% in the past 10 years, with most of this reduction happening in the past 4 years. Black coal has in fact sustained a steady decrease in generation since 2008-09, while most of the decrease in brown coal has occurred in the past 12 months. This sharp decrease in brown coal is partly due to the flooding and industrial action at Yallourn and coincides with the introduction of our carbon price. The steady decrease in black coal generation, however, suggests that black coal generators may have been more strongly impacted by softening electricity demand and increasing renewable share. Against this decrease in coal generation, gas generation has more than doubled in the past 10 years. Most of this increase happened in New South Wales and Queensland, where there are government policies in place to encourage gas generation. In analysing the fuel efficiency in coal generators, we also made an interesting finding in that decreasing utilisation rates did not appear to have negatively impacted fuel efficiency. This is likely to have been due to selective closures of less efficient units, as seen in the recent mothballing announcements of coal capacity. May also have been due to operational improvements that are regularly undertaken to maintain or improve the efficiency of generation units, while other companies have mentioned using better quality coal to improve their fuel efficiency where it's economically feasible to do so. This finding refutes claims that coal power stations don't reduce the amount of coal they burn and the emissions they produce when renewable generation increases. Looking forward, further improvements are expected from all areas in the power sector, especially renewable generation. Demand for grid electricity is expected to remain low, growing by 6% from 2010-11 to 2020. Renewable generation is expected to double or increase by 113%, while gas and coal generation are expected to decrease by 6% and 2% respectively. These improvements would see emissions from electricity generation continue to decrease to 2020. We combine our analysis in the buildings and industry sectors with recent trends that we've seen in the power sector, and through this analysis, we expect demand for grid-supplied electricity to remain low to 2020, growing by 6% from 2010-11. This compares to a 14% growth that was previously forecasted in 2012. Existing policies and trends in the buildings sector is also likely to see further uptake of small-scale solar PV in the residential sector, while cogeneration could also increase in commercial buildings. Energy efficiency improvements are likely to continue and further decrease the demand for grid electricity in buildings. Strong energy efficiency improvements are also expected in industry, while a soft manufacturing outlook will also contain demand for grid electricity to lower rates compared to strong historic growths. Growth in demand for grid electricity is expected to come from increases in floor space in commercial buildings and the potential connection of new LNG plants in Queensland. Meeting the large-scale renewable energy target, or the RET, would see a doubling of renewable generation compared to today's levels. In examining the capacity of renewable projects in the pipeline, we found that the physical capacity to meet the RET already exists. There is, in fact, twice the amount of capacity in the pipeline to meet the RET. In other words, there is no shortage of project proponents or suitable sites, as only half of the renewable capacity currently in the pipeline will need to be constructed to meet the RET in 2020. It is important to note, however, that implementing all these projects needed to meet the RET would represent a significant ramp-up in the rate of construction of new renewable generation assets. Apart from this legislated target for renewable energy generation, there is significant funding being targeted at deployment and implementation of renewable technologies, which could further encourage construction of renewable capacity. Our interviews with companies, however, have indicated that further policy stability will be important in ensuring investments in new renewable capacity. Companies have mentioned that the upcoming review of the RET legislation and amendments to state planning regulations are examples of policy uncertainty that could present challenges to further deployment of renewable capacity from now to 2020. An increasing renewable share and soft demand for grid electricity are expected to lead to further decreases in coal and gas generation. The increase in renewable generation to meet the RET would more than meet the growth in demand from now to 2020, translating to an absolute decrease in coal generation going forward. Recent reductions in coal generation are likely to continue, with overall coal generation expected to decrease by a further 2%. While brown coal will decrease to a lesser extent compared to black coal, renewable generation would also exceed brown coal generation in 2020 if the large-scale renewable energy target is met. Looking at the capacity of fossil fuel projects in the pipeline, it is also found that there is no new coal power stations in advanced stages of the project pipeline. Given the long lead times for construction of generation assets and the perceived reputational risks associated with building greenfield coal plants, it is unlikely any new assets will be built in the near future. As such, it is unlikely there would be much risk of lock-in from new major coal projects. Continuing soft demand for grid electricity and further improvements to the electricity generation mix would see a further 11% improvement in the emissions intensity of Australia's grid-supplied electricity. This improvement in emissions intensity would more than offset the growth in demand for grid electricity between now and 2020, with emissions reducing by a further 1%. In order to compare the recent abatement activities in the power sector with the abatement potential we identified in our low-carbon growth plan for Australia, emissions reduction that have occurred in the past 2 years were quantified and presented as abatement in this waterfall graph. If no further abatement activity occurred past 2010, emissions in the power sector would increase by 17% or 32 megatons as seen in the third column on this graph. This will, however, be more than offset by the expected abatement from the power, industry and buildings sectors. A total of 48.5 megatons of abatement is expected from the power sector, much of this coming from improvements to the generation mix, as discussed on my earlier slides. Reductions in demand from the buildings and industry sectors would also contribute 16 megatons of abatement by reducing the volume of electricity that will need to be generated. All of the above means that emissions could decrease by 9% from 2010-11 to 2020. The abatement expected from improvements to the electricity generation mix have been quantified and compared with the abatement potential identified to meet the 25% emissions reduction potential in our low-carbon growth plan for Australia. As shown on my earlier slide, a total of 33 megatons of abatement would be captured if recent trends are sustained. The grey bar here represents further potential that has been identified and shows that there is a further 69 megatons available but uncaptured in the power sector. This additional potential represents further shift from coal to renewables and gas. Achieving this additional potential would depend on further changes to policy or economic settings because current data shows that costs to achieve this are still relatively high. To summarize, there has been a strong shift to low emissions generation sources in the past decade, including renewables and less emissions-intensive gas generation both increasing. Recent decreases in demand for grid electricity has also led to absolute reductions in emissions from electricity generation. These trends are expected to continue and lead to further decrease in emissions to 2020. There is, however, more potential for a larger shift towards renewables, which would allow the power sector to capture more of the potential we have identified. Thank you.